The first light of dawn spilled across the vast plains of Wyoming Territory, 1876, casting long shadows over the small cemetery on the edge of Broken Creek. Lila O'Hara stood motionless before a fresh grave, her black mourning dress billowing gently in the morning breeze. For 3 weeks now she had come at sunrise, a ritual of grief performed with unwavering devotion since they'd laid her husband in the cold ground. "You shouldn't be out here alone, madam," a deep voice called from behind. Lila didn't turn. She knew who it was. Preston Vance, the cowboy who'd ridden into town 2 days after her husband's funeral. Everyone in Broken Creek had quickly learned his story. A former Texas Ranger turned cattle driver looking for honest work after years on the trail. "I'm not alone, Mr. Vance," she replied softly, eyes still fixed on the headstone. "My heart's in the ground." Preston removed his hat, revealing sun-bronzed features framed by dark hair that fell just past his collar. His blue eyes, weathered at the corners from years squinting against harsh sunlight, held a gentleness that belied his rugged appearance. "Then I'll sit beside it with you," he said simply, lowering himself to the earth next to the grave, placing his hat respectfully on his knee. Lila finally looked at him. At 31, she was no longer young by frontier standards, yet neither was she ready to fade into widowhood as so many expected. Her auburn hair, usually neatly pinned, had partly come loose in the wind, framing a face marked both by natural beauty and recent sorrow. "You don't even know him," she said. "Thomas O'Hara," Preston replied, nodding toward the headstone. "Storekeeper, husband respected by all in town, shot by rustlers when he stumbled upon them taking horses from the livery." He paused. "I've heard the stories, been in town nearly 2 weeks now." "And you've appointed yourself my guardian?" "No, madam. Just thought no one should face the sunrise alone if they don't have to." The rising sun had now cleared the distant mountains, bathing the cemetery in golden light. A meadowlark called from a nearby fence post, its cheerful song at odds with the summer setting. "I've faced many things alone, Mr. Vance. This is just one more." Preston nodded, making no move to leave. "My offer stands. Silence shared is often easier to bear than silence alone." And so they sat as the morning grew warmer, two strangers bound by nothing more than grief and the vast emptiness of the Wyoming frontier. 3 days later, Preston pushed open the door to O'Hara's general store, the bell above jingling cheerfully. The shop was the heart of Broken Creek. Everything from coffee beans to saddle soap, fabric to firearms, could be found on its crowded shelves. Despite her mourning, Lila had reopened the store just a week after the funeral, refusing the well-meaning offers from townspeople to run it for her. "Good morning, Mrs. O'Hara," Preston said, removing his hat as he approached the counter. Lila looked up from the ledger she'd been writing in. Today, her hair was neatly pinned, her black dress crisp and proper. Only her eyes, still rimmed with shadows, betrayed her ongoing grief. "Mr. Vance." "What can I help you with today?" "Just some tobacco and coffee, if you please." As she measured the coffee beans, Preston studied the store. It was well organized but showing signs of strain. A few shelves were nearly empty and the usual gleam of the brass scale had dulled. "I heard you turned down the offer from Mr. Baldwin," he said casually, referring to the town's banker who had been pressuring Lila to sell the store since Thomas's death. Lila's hand paused momentarily over the coffee beans. "News travels fast in Broken Creek. Small towns always do. Mr. Baldwin believes a woman can't run a business alone. I intend to prove him wrong." Preston nodded, his respect for her determination growing. "Fair enough. Though I imagine restocking will be difficult with the supply wagons not due for another month." Lila tied the package of coffee with more force than necessary. "I'll manage. I'm heading to Laramie next week," Preston said, placing coins on the counter. "I could bring back whatever supplies you need, save you the trouble of waiting for the regular delivery." Suspicion flashed in her eyes. "Why would you do that?" "Because I need the work and you need the supplies." "And Mr. Baldwin didn't put you up to this. Another attempt to show me I can't manage on my own." Preston met her gaze steadily. "Mrs. O'Hara, I don't work for bankers, never have, never will. I'm offering because it makes sense for both of us, nothing more." Something in his straightforward manner seemed to convince her. Lila's shoulders relaxed slightly as she handed him his purchases. "I'll think about it, Mr. Vance." That evening, the setting sun painted Broken Creek's main street in hues of orange and gold. Preston sat on the porch of the Silver Dollar Saloon, whittling a small piece of wood and watching the townspeople head home for supper. Sheriff Miller paused as he passed by, his silver star catching the fading light. "Evening, Vance. Still planning on heading to Laramie?" Preston nodded. "Yes, sir. Just waiting to see if Mrs. O'Hara wants me to bring back supplies for the store." The sheriff leaned against a post, studying Preston with narrowed eyes. "Folks are talking about you spending time at the cemetery with her. Folks ought to mind their own business. She's well respected in this town. Thomas was too." Preston set down his knife. "I understand what you're saying, Sheriff. I mean no disrespect to Mrs. O'Hara or her husband's memory." Sheriff Miller nodded slowly. "Good, because that woman's been through enough without adding gossip to her troubles." He straightened. "You were a ranger, right? For 7 years." "Thought so. I can spot the type." The sheriff adjusted his gun belt. "Just remember, this isn't Texas, and we like things peaceful here in Broken Creek." After the sheriff continued on his rounds, Preston remained on the porch, turning the small wooden figure in his hands. He'd carved a meadowlark, its wings partially extended as if caught between staying and flying away. The next morning, Lila found him waiting outside the store before opening. "I've decided to accept your offer, Mr. Vance," she said as she unlocked the door. "I've prepared a list of supplies we need most urgently." Inside, she handed him a carefully written inventory. The list was practical and thorough: flour, sugar, coffee, ammunition, fabric, medicine, all the essentials a frontier town required. "This is a lot to transport alone," Preston observed. "Can you handle it?" "Yes, but it would be easier with a wagon. Do you have one I could use?" Lila hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Thomas kept a wagon behind the store. It hasn't been used since." She didn't finish the sentence. "I'll check it over, make sure it's trail-worthy." As Preston turned to leave, Lila called after him. "Mr. Vance," he paused at the door. "Thank you. Most men in town think I should just sell the store and live off the proceeds until I can find another husband." Preston smiled slightly. "With respect, Mrs. O'Hara, I don't think you're the type of woman who does what most people think you should." For the first time since they'd met, Lila's lips curved into something almost resembling a smile. "No, Mr. Vance, I don't believe I am." The wagon indeed needed work. Preston spent 2 days repairing a broken axle and replacing worn leather on the harness. By the time he was ready to depart for Laramie, word had spread through Broken Creek that the widow O'Hara was sending the newcomer on a supply run. On the morning of his departure, several townspeople gathered to watch. Among them was Edgar Baldwin, the banker, his disapproval evident in the tight line of his mouth as he observed Preston loading the last of his gear into the wagon. "Vance," Baldwin called, approaching with measured steps. "A word, if you don't mind." Preston straightened, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Mr. Baldwin." The banker was a well-dressed man in his 50s, his waistcoat straining slightly over his prosperous belly. "I understand you're doing some work for Mrs. O'Hara." "That's right." "I'd like to offer you a proposition. I'm prepared to pay you twice whatever she's offering if you'll delay your return by a week or two." Preston's expression hardened. "And why would you want that?" Baldwin lowered his voice. "The widow's stubborn, but reality will set in eventually. Another few weeks of empty shelves might help her see reason about selling the store. To you, I presume. It's a fair offer I've made her, more than fair." Preston checked the harness one final time, his movements deliberate. "Mr. Baldwin, where I come from, a man who tries to profit from a widow's misfortune isn't held in high regard." The banker's face flushed. "This is business, not charity. That store needs a man's hand. The sooner she realizes that, the better for everyone." "Not everyone," Preston replied, climbing onto the wagon seat. "Just you." As he prepared to depart, Lila emerged from the store carrying a small package. She approached the wagon, ignoring Baldwin's presence entirely. "Some provisions for your journey," she said, handing the package to Preston. "And this is half your payment in advance." She offered a small pouch that clinked with coins. Their hands touched briefly during the exchange, and for a moment something passed between them, a shared understanding, perhaps, or recognition of a common adversary in Baldwin. "I should be back within 10 days, weather permitting," Preston said. Lila nodded. "Safe travels, Mr. Vance." As Preston drove the wagon out of town, he could feel Baldwin's hostile gaze following him. The banker's interference confirmed what he'd suspected. Lila O'Hara's struggle to maintain her independence went beyond mere grief. There were those in Broken Creek who stood to gain from her failure. The journey to Laramie was arduous but uneventful. Spring rains had left the trails muddy in places, slowing his progress. Still, Preston made good time, reaching the larger settlement on the third day. Laramie was a bustling town compared to Broken Creek, with a proper train station and businesses that catered to the increasing number of settlers moving west. Preston spent 2 days acquiring all the items on Lila's list, carefully selecting quality goods and negotiating fair prices. In the evenings, he wrote detailed records of his purchases, determined to prove himself trustworthy with her money. On the night before his departure back to Broken Creek, he was approached in the hotel dining room by a well-dressed man who introduced himself as James Harrington, a representative from the Western Railroad Company. "Mr. Vance, I understand you're associated with Broken Creek," Harrington said, taking a seat without waiting for an invitation. Preston regarded him cautiously. "I'm doing some work there, yes." "Excellent. I've been trying to make contact with property owners in that area." Harrington leaned forward eagerly. "The railroad is planning a spur line that would pass directly through Broken Creek. It would transform that little settlement overnight. I'm sure the townspeople would welcome that news. Indeed, particularly those who own property along the proposed route." Harrington pulled out a folded map, spreading it on the table. "The O'Hara store, for instance, sits on a particularly valuable parcel." Preston's eyes narrowed as understanding dawned. "So that's why Baldwin's so keen to get his hands on it." Harrington looked surprised. "Baldwin, Edgar Baldwin. He's not supposed to be approaching property owners directly. Our arrangement was quite clear." "What arrangement would that be?" Realizing he'd said too much, Harrington hastily refolded his map. "Nothing of consequence, just standard business procedures." He rose from his chair. "If you happen to speak with Mrs. O'Hara, you might mention that the railroad would be interested in discussing her property. We pay very generously." After Harrington departed, Preston sat for a long while, contemplating this new information. The railroad's interest explained Baldwin's persistence and his underhanded tactics. Land that would soon become a railroad stop would be worth many times its current value. The return journey to Broken Creek seemed longer, despite the wagon being heavily laden with supplies. Preston found himself pushing the pace, concerned about what might be transpiring in his absence. His concerns proved justified. As he approached Broken Creek on the afternoon of the 9th day, he was met on the outskirts by young Tommy Wilson, the blacksmith's son, riding hard toward him. "Mr. Vance," the boy called, reining his horse alongside the wagon. "Sheriff Miller sent me to find you. There's trouble at Mrs. O'Hara's store." "What kind of trouble?" Preston asked sharply. "Some men came yesterday. They said they were collecting a debt Mr. O'Hara owed. They're threatening to take the store if Mrs. O'Hara doesn't pay by sundown today." Preston flicked the reins, urging the horses to a faster pace. "Where's the sheriff now?" "At the store with Mrs. O'Hara. He told me to hurry." When Preston reached the store, he found a small crowd gathered outside. Sheriff Miller stood on the porch beside Lila, facing 3 rough-looking men. Baldwin was there too, standing slightly apart but watching the proceedings with evident interest. Preston handed the reins to Tommy. "Take the wagon around back," he instructed, then made his way through the crowd. "I've told you already," Lila was saying, her voice carrying clearly despite its steadiness. "My husband kept meticulous records. There was no such loan." The apparent leader of the 3 men, a burly fellow with a scar running down one cheek, sneered. "Your husband borrowed $500 from Mr. Reynolds in Cheyenne. With interest, it's now $700. We've got papers to prove it." "Let me see these papers," Sheriff Miller demanded. The man produced a document from his coat. Preston, now at the edge of the porch, noted how conveniently new the paper appeared for a loan supposedly made over a year ago. The sheriff examined the document with a frown. This looks irregular. The signature doesn't match other examples of Thomas's writing I've seen. Don't matter none, the scarred man replied. It's legal and binding. Mrs. O'Hara pays today or we take possession of the store as payment. That's not how the law works, Sheriff Miller said firmly. Even if this debt were legitimate, which I doubt, you'd need a court order to seize property. We got backing from a territorial judge, another of the men said, producing another document with an official-looking seal. As the sheriff examined this new paper, Preston stepped forward, catching Lila's eye. The relief on her face at seeing him was momentarily unguarded before she composed herself. These men arrived yesterday, she explained quietly as the sheriff continued to debate with the debt collectors. They claim Thomas borrowed money last spring when he went to Cheyenne for supplies. Did he? Preston asked. No, we had saved for that trip for months. He was proud that we didn't need to borrow. Her voice caught slightly. He would have told me if there had been a loan. Preston nodded, then turned his attention to the confrontation. Gentlemen, he interrupted, I've just returned from Laramie with Mrs. O'Hara's supplies. I had some interesting conversations there that might be relevant to this situation. All eyes turned to him. Baldwin shifted uncomfortably. A representative from the Western Railroad Company informed me they're planning a spur line through Broken Creek. This store sits on what will soon be very valuable land. Preston fixed his gaze on the scarred man. Convenient timing for a debt to suddenly appear, wouldn't you say? A murmur ran through the crowd. The debt collectors exchanged glances and Baldwin's face had gone pale. That's a serious accusation, the sheriff said, looking between Preston and Baldwin. It is, Preston agreed, and easily verified. The railroad representative, a Mr. Harrington, mentioned having prior arrangements with certain parties in Broken Creek. He looked pointedly at Baldwin. Perhaps Mr. Baldwin could clarify the nature of those arrangements. The banker's composure cracked. This is preposterous. I know nothing about any debt collectors. Strange, Preston said. I never suggested you did. Sheriff Miller's hand moved to rest on his pistol. Gentlemen, he addressed the three men, I think it's time you explained exactly who sent you here. What followed was a tense standoff that ended with a confession. The debt collectors admitted they had been hired to pressure Lila into selling the store. While they wouldn't directly implicate Baldwin, the evidence was damning enough that the sheriff ordered them to leave town immediately or face arrest for fraud. As the crowd dispersed, Baldwin approached Lila, his manner now conciliatory. Mrs. O'Hara, despite this unfortunate misunderstanding, my offer to purchase the store still stands. In fact, given this news about the railroad, I'm prepared to increase it substantially. Lila regarded him coldly. Mr. Baldwin, even if I were inclined to sell, which I am not, you would be the last person in the Wyoming Territory I would sell to. The banker's face hardened. You're making a mistake. A woman alone can't. She's not alone, Preston interrupted. And I suggest you leave now before the sheriff reconsiders letting you walk free. After Baldwin stalked away, Lila turned to Preston. Thank you for everything. Just doing the job you hired me for, he replied with a slight smile. Speaking of which, your supplies are in the wagon out back. Together they began unloading the wagon, bringing the much-needed goods into the store. As they worked side by side, Preston recounted his journey and the full details of his conversation with Harrington. So the railroad is really coming? Lila asked, pausing with a sack of flour in her arms. According to Harrington, yes, within the year if their plans hold. That will change everything for Broken Creek. It will. For the better, I think, though change always brings its own challenges. They continued working until well after sunset, restocking the store's shelves. The familiar rhythm of the task seemed to comfort Lila, and Preston noticed her movements becoming more fluid, less burdened as the evening progressed. When the last crate had been emptied, Lila brewed coffee, and they sat at the small table in the back room of the store where Thomas had once kept the accounts. A single lantern cast a warm glow over the space. Why did you really help me, Mr. Vance? Lila asked suddenly. And don't say it was just for the work. Preston considered his answer carefully. When I first saw you at the cemetery, you reminded me of someone who, myself, 5 years ago. He stared into his coffee cup. I lost my wife and daughter to typhoid in '71. For a long time afterward, I couldn't see any path forward, just existed, moving from place to place, taking whatever work came my way. Lila's expression softened with understanding. I'm sorry. Don't be. Time passes, the pain changes, becomes something you can carry without it crushing you. He looked up at her. When you said your heart was in the ground, I recognized that feeling. And now, is your heart still there? Parts of it always will be, but I've learned there's room for more than just grief. He set his cup down. You're stronger than most, Mrs. O'Hara. The way you fought for this store, for your independence, it's admirable. Lila, she said quietly. After everything, I think you should call me Lila. Preston then. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall. Outside, Broken Creek had settled into the stillness of night, the distant piano from the saloon providing the only evidence that the town hadn't completely surrendered to slumber. What will you do now? Lila finally asked. Move on to the next town. Preston hadn't given it much thought. Since arriving in Broken Creek, his focus had narrowed to helping Lila and uncovering Baldwin's scheme. The prospect of leaving now felt unexpectedly uncomfortable. I hadn't decided, he admitted. There's still work to be done here if you'd be interested in hiring me again. What kind of work? With the railroad coming, this place will need expanding. New shelving, a bigger storeroom, I'm handy with tools. Lila studied him for a long moment. Are you offering because you think I need help or because you want to stay? Both, I suppose, Preston answered honestly. Would that be so terrible? No, she said softly. I don't believe it would. The following week saw a transformation in both the store and its owner. As Preston worked on expanding the storeroom and building new shelves, Lila began reaching out to suppliers in Laramie and Cheyenne, preparing for the increased business the railroad would bring. Her natural aptitude for commerce, previously overshadowed by her husband's presence, blossomed as she took full control of the business. Preston found himself settling into life in Broken Creek more comfortably than he'd expected. He rented a small cabin on the edge of town but spent most of his days at the store. In the evenings, he and Lila would often sit on the store's back porch, watching the sunset and talking about the day's events or sharing stories from their pasts. One such evening, about a month after the confrontation with the debt collectors, Lila mentioned Thomas for the first time without the edge of raw grief in her voice. Thomas always wanted to expand the store, she said, looking out at the half-built addition Preston had been working on. He had drawings, plans for what it could become. He sounds like he was a forward-thinking man. He was. Lila smiled at some private memory. We met in St. Louis. I was working as a seamstress and he came in to have a shirt mended. He talked about the West for hours, all the opportunity waiting for those brave enough to claim it. Is that why you came here? For opportunity? Partly, and partly to escape. Her expression grew distant. My father arranged a marriage for me to a man 3 times my age. Thomas offered a different path. She turned to Preston. What about you? What brought you to the Rangers? Family tradition, initially. My father and grandfather both served, but I stayed because it gave me purpose, a clear sense of right and wrong in a world that often blurs the lines. And after you lost your family, what gave you purpose then? Preston was quiet for a moment. Movement, I suppose. As long as I kept moving, I didn't have to face the emptiness. Until recently, I hadn't stayed anywhere longer than a month since they died. Why is Broken Creek different? Lila asked, her eyes intent on his face in the fading light. I think you know why, Preston replied softly. The moment hung between them, fragile and laden with possibility. Lila looked away first, rising from her chair. It's getting late, she said, though the sun had barely set. I should close up the store, Preston nodded, respecting her need for distance. I'll finish the new counter tomorrow, should make restocking easier. As he walked back to his cabin that night, Preston reflected on how his feelings for Lila had developed so gradually that he'd barely noticed until they were firmly rooted. It wasn't the desperate, consuming love he'd felt in his youth for his late wife, but something steadier, a deep appreciation for Lila's strength, her determination, her resilience. The next morning, news arrived that would test that resilience further. A telegram from Cheyenne confirmed that the railroad plans had been approved. Construction would begin within 2 months, with Broken Creek designated as an official stop on the new spur line. The town erupted in celebration. For most residents, the railroad meant prosperity, increased trade, new settlers, growth. For Lila, however, it brought renewed pressure from Baldwin, who had not abandoned his desire to acquire her property. The banker appeared at the store during the busiest time of day, deliberately creating an audience for his announcement. "Mrs. O'Hara," he said loudly as he entered, "in light of the official railroad announcement, I'm prepared to offer you $3,000 for this property. Triple my original offer." The store fell silent, customers turning to watch the exchange. $3,000 was a fortune in the Wyoming Territory, enough to start a new life anywhere with considerable comfort. Lila, who had been helping a customer select fabric, straightened. "Mr. Baldwin, I believe I've made my position clear. The store is not for sale." "Be reasonable," he persisted. "This is a businessman's opportunity. The railroad will require negotiations, contracts, relationships with other businesses, matters a woman alone cannot possibly navigate successfully." From the back of the store, Preston watched the exchange, ready to intervene, but knowing Lila would prefer to handle Baldwin herself. "I'm not alone, Mr. Baldwin," Lila replied, her voice carrying clearly through the store. "I have the support of this community, many of whom are witnessing your persistent harassment." She gestured to the customers surrounding them. "Furthermore, I've already been in contact with Mr. Harrington regarding the railroad's requirements. He was quite impressed with my business proposal." Baldwin's face reddened. "This is absurd. You'll regret refusing my offer." "The only thing I regret," Lila said evenly, "is the time you've wasted that could have been spent serving paying customers. Good day, Mr. Baldwin." After the banker stormed out, a smattering of applause broke out among the customers. Preston approached Lila, admiration evident in his expression. "Business proposal?" he asked quietly. A small, satisfied smile played at her lips. "I've been corresponding with Mr. Harrington for weeks. The store will serve as the official supply depot for railroad workers during construction, and afterward will handle freight receiving for the entire town." Preston shook his head in amazement. "You continue to surprise me, Lila O'Hara." "Good," she replied, her smile widening. "I'd hate to become predictable." That evening, after closing the store, Lila surprised Preston by suggesting they have dinner at the hotel restaurant, a rare luxury in Broken Creek, and the closest thing to a formal dining establishment the town possessed. "What's the occasion?" Preston asked as they were seated at a table covered with actual linen. "Success," Lila replied. "The railroad contract, Baldwin's defeat, the store's expansion nearly complete, all worth celebrating, don't you think?" Preston agreed, and they enjoyed a meal far superior to the usual fare available in town. The hotel owner, Mrs. Peterson, had outdone herself with roast beef, fresh vegetables from her garden, and even a bottle of wine that had been saving for a special occasion. As they ate, Lila spoke more openly than ever before about her hopes for the future. "When Thomas and I came here, we had such dreams," she said, twirling the stem of her wine glass. "Not just for the store, but for ourselves. Children, a proper house with glass windows, maybe even a trip back east someday to show our success to those who doubted us." "Those dreams don't have to die with him," Preston said gently. "No, but they change, become something different." She looked directly at him. "I've been thinking about what you said that day at the cemetery, about sitting beside my heart in the ground." Preston waited, sensing she needed to find her own words. "For months after Thomas died, I felt like I was just a shadow, moving through each day by force of habit. Opening the store, serving customers, closing up, all without really being present." She took a breath. "But lately, I've started to feel substantial again. Real, I've noticed," Preston said. "You laugh more, plan for the future instead of just surviving the present." "Yes." Lila reached across the table, hesitantly placing her hand over his. "I think perhaps my heart isn't entirely in the ground anymore. Parts of it have found their way back." Preston turned his hand to clasp hers. "I'm glad to hear that." They walked back to the store under a canopy of stars, the night air crisp with the promise of approaching autumn. When they reached her door, Lila paused, keys in hand. "Would you like to come in for coffee?" she asked. Preston hesitated, aware of how such an invitation might appear to others in town, concerned for her reputation. Lila seemed to read his thoughts. "I'm not worried about gossip, Preston. I stopped caring what this town thinks the day they expected me to give up everything Thomas and I built together." "It's not that," Preston said. "I just don't want to rush you into anything you might regret." "I've had months of solitude to think about regrets," Lila replied. "And I've decided that my greatest regret would be not recognizing happiness when it's standing right in front of me, out of some misplaced sense of propriety." In the soft glow of the lantern she had lit, her eyes held a certainty that dissolved Preston's hesitation. He followed her inside. They talked late into the night, sharing stories they hadn't told before. Lila about her childhood in St. Louis, Preston about his years with the Rangers and the adventures that had shaped him. When he finally rose to leave, Lila walked him to the door. "Preston," she said, her voice quiet but steady, "I want you to know that I'm not looking to replace what I lost. Thomas will always have a place in my heart." "I would never ask you to forget him," Preston replied. "Just as I can't forget Eliza and little Sarah, they're part of who we are." Lila nodded, relief evident in her expression. "Then you understand." "I do." He took her hand gently. "Whatever this is between us, it's not about replacing the past. It's about finding something new, something that belongs just to us." "I'd like that," she whispered. Preston bent down and kissed her softly, a brief meeting of lips that carried the promise of more to come. When they parted, Lila's eyes remained closed for a moment, as if preserving the sensation. "Good night, Lila," he said. "Good night, Preston." As summer gave way to autumn, Broken Creek began preparing for the arrival of the railroad construction crew. The town council, with Lila now among its members, the first woman ever appointed, organized accommodations and supplies for the influx of workers expected to arrive before the first snow. Preston had completed the store expansion and taken on additional carpentry work throughout the town. He and Lila settled into a comfortable routine, working separately during the day but spending most evenings together. Their relationship progressed slowly, each step forward deliberate and considered. One crisp October morning, as Preston was helping to construct new housing for the railroad workers, Sheriff Miller approached with news. "Telegram came for you," he said, handing Preston a folded paper. "From Texas." Preston set down his hammer and opened the message, scanning its contents with a furrowing brow. "It's from my former captain with the Rangers. He's asking me to return to Texas. They're reforming my old unit." Sheriff Miller raised an eyebrow. "You thinking of going back?" "No," Preston said without hesitation. "My life is here now. Glad to hear it. Town's better with you in it." The sheriff cleared his throat. "Speaking of which, there's something else I wanted to discuss. I'm getting too old for this job, thinking of retiring next spring." "Town council's looking for candidates to replace me." Preston looked up in surprise. "And you're suggesting me you've got the experience, the temperament for it. Folks here respect you." The sheriff shrugged. "Just something to consider." As Miller walked away, Preston reread the telegram, reflecting on how dramatically his life had changed in just a few months. The restlessness that had driven him for years had gradually subsided, replaced by a sense of belonging he hadn't felt since losing his family. That evening, he showed the telegram to Lila as they sat by the fire in her living quarters above the store. "They want you back," she said after reading it. "Will you go?" "No," Preston said firmly, "but I did have an interesting conversation with Sheriff Miller today. He's retiring in the spring, suggested I might be a good replacement." Lila set down her sewing. "Sheriff Vance," she tested the title. "It suits you, you think so?" "I do. You've always had a strong sense of justice, and the town already looks to you to settle disputes." She smiled. "Though I imagine your duties would keep you quite busy." "Too busy to help with the store, you mean?" "Perhaps, but not too busy for other things that matter." Preston reached over and took her hand. "Lila, I need to ask you something important." She set aside her sewing completely, giving him her full attention. "These past months with you have been the happiest I've known in years," he continued. I know it might seem too soon, and if it is, I understand, but I don't want to waste any more time than we've already lost. Understanding dawned in Lila's eyes. Preston. He slid from his chair to one knee before her. I'm not asking you to forget Thomas or to stop loving him. I'm just asking if there might be room in your heart for me too. Tears glistened in Lila's eyes. My heart has more room than I ever imagined possible, she whispered. Yes, Preston, yes. The news of their engagement spread quickly through Broken Creek. Most townspeople responded with genuine happiness. They had watched the relationship develop and seen how both Lila and Preston had flourished together. A few, Baldwin chief among them, were less enthusiastic, but their disapproval carried little weight against the community's general approval. The wedding was set for December, before the worst of winter set in, and while travel was still possible for the few distant friends they had invited. Preparations began immediately, with the women of the town helping Lila create a wedding dress from the finest fabric in her store. As the date approached, Preston moved his belongings from the small cabin he'd been renting to the rooms above the store. They had agreed that after the wedding, they would begin looking for land to build a proper house, but for now, the store would remain their home. 2 weeks before the wedding, the first contingent of railroad workers arrived, accompanied by Mr. Harrington himself. The town welcomed them with a celebration at the newly expanded hotel, where Harrington made a speech about the prosperity the railroad would bring to Broken Creek. After the formal proceedings, Harrington sought out Lila and Preston. Mrs. O'Hara, Mr. Vance, he greeted them warmly. A pleasure to see you both again, and congratulations on your upcoming nuptials. I was delighted to hear the news. Thank you, Mr. Harrington, Lila replied. We're pleased the railroad is proceeding as planned. Indeed, and largely thanks to your excellent arrangements for supplies and accommodation. I must say, when Mr. Baldwin first approached the company about Broken Creek, we had no idea we would find such capable business partners here. Preston's expression hardened slightly at the mention of Baldwin. Speaking of Baldwin, has he continued his involvement with the railroad? Harrington looked uncomfortable. Well, no, after certain irregularities came to light regarding his land acquisition tactics, the company decided to sever ties. I believe he's leaving Broken Creek, actually. Accepted a position at a bank in Denver. Lila and Preston exchanged glances. This was the first they'd heard of Baldwin's departure. That's welcome news, Lila said diplomatically, though I wish him well in his new position. The wedding day arrived with a light dusting of snow that transformed Broken Creek into something from a fairy tale. The small church was filled to capacity, decorated with evergreen boughs and ribbons. Sheriff Miller gave Lila away, and Mrs. Peterson, the hotel owner, served as matron of honor. As Lila walked down the aisle in her cream-colored dress, her auburn hair crowned with a wreath of winter berries, Preston felt a sense of completeness he had thought lost forever. They had both endured profound loss, walked through darkness, and somehow found each other on the other side. The ceremony was brief but meaningful. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Preston kissed Lila with a tenderness that brought tears to many eyes in the congregation. The celebration afterward lasted well into the evening, with music, dancing, and more food than the small town had seen at one gathering in years. Late that night, as the party finally wound down, Preston and Lila slipped away to the cemetery on the edge of town. In the moonlight, they stood before Thomas O'Hara's grave in respectful silence. Lila knelt and placed a small bouquet of winter flowers on the grave. I wanted him to know, she explained, rising to stand beside Preston again, that I'm happy that life goes on. Preston nodded, understanding completely. He would want that for you, for us, Lila corrected gently. This new life we're building, it doesn't erase what came before, it honors it. As they walked back toward town, arm in arm through the snow, Preston remembered their first conversation at this same cemetery months before. You told me your heart was in the ground, he said quietly. And you offered to sit beside it with me, Lila replied. I think that's when I first began to heal, when I realized I didn't have to face the grief alone. Preston stopped walking, turning to face his new wife. I meant what I said that day. I'll sit beside you through whatever comes, Lila, the good and the bad. She reached up to touch his face, her eyes reflecting the moonlight. I know you will, and I'll do the same for you. They sealed this promise with a kiss, standing beneath the vast Wyoming sky, two people who had found in each other not a replacement for what was lost, but a new beginning neither had expected to find. Spring arrived early in 1877, bringing with it rapid changes to Broken Creek. The railroad construction progressed steadily, and with it came new businesses and settlers attracted by the promise of prosperity. Lila's store flourished with the increased demand, requiring her to hire 2 assistants to manage the expanded inventory. Preston had been officially appointed as sheriff after Miller's retirement in March, a position that suited his temperament and experience. Together, he and Lila had become something of a power couple in the growing town, she representing commerce, and he maintaining order as Broken Creek underwent its transformation. They had purchased land on the edge of town and begun construction on a house of their own, a comfortable 2-story home with a wide porch, and, as Lila had always dreamed, real glass windows. Preston worked on it during his free time, determined to build as much of it with his own hands as possible. One evening in late April, as they sat on the partially completed porch watching the sunset, Lila shared news that would change their lives once more. Preston, she said, her voice carrying a hint of nervousness, there's something I need to tell you. He turned to her, concern immediately crossing his features. What is it? Is something wrong? No, she smiled, taking his hand and placing it gently on her stomach. Something's very right. Understanding dawned on Preston's face, followed by an expression of such pure joy that Lila felt her own eyes fill with tears in response. You're certain? He asked, his voice hushed with awe. Dr. Collins confirmed it yesterday. We're going to have a baby, Preston, in October. He gathered her into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. A baby, he repeated, the words both a statement and a prayer. Our baby. In that moment, on the porch of their unfinished home, with the promise of new life growing between them, both felt the final pieces of their hearts, the parts that had remained buried in grief, resurface and begin to heal. The following months passed in a blur of activity. The house was completed by July, just in time for the official opening of the railroad line to Broken Creek. The town held a grand celebration, with Lila now visibly expecting cutting the ribbon alongside the territorial governor who had come for the occasion. As autumn approached, they prepared the nursery, painting the walls a soft yellow and filling it with furniture Preston had crafted himself. The cradle, in particular, was a work of art, carved with intricate patterns of meadowlarks in flight, a reminder of those mornings at the cemetery where their journey together had begun. On a clear October morning, as the first frost silvered the grass outside their window, Lila went into labor. The midwife was summoned, and Preston paced anxiously outside the bedroom door, each of Lila's cries cutting through him like a physical pain. After what seemed an eternity, the midwife opened the door. Sheriff Vance, you have a daughter. Preston entered the room with trembling steps. Lila lay propped against pillows, exhausted but radiant, cradling a small bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. She looked up as he approached, her smile conveying everything words could not. Come meet your daughter, she whispered. Preston sat carefully on the edge of the bed and peered at the tiny face nestled against Lila's breast. The baby had a dusting of dark hair, and when she briefly opened her eyes, he saw they were the deep blue of a summer sky. She's perfect, he breathed, reaching out to touch her impossibly small hand. The baby reflexively grasped his finger, and Preston felt his heart expand with a love so powerful it was almost overwhelming. What shall we name her? Lila asked. Preston considered for a moment. What about Hope? It seems fitting. Hope, Lila repeated, testing the name. Hope Eliza Vance, for new beginnings and in memory of what came before. It's perfect, Preston agreed, his voice thick with emotion, just like her. As the first snow of winter blanketed Broken Creek in white, the Vance family settled into a rhythm centered around their new addition. Hope proved to be a good-natured baby, with Lila's determination and Preston's calm temperament. The store continued to prosper under the management of Lila's assistants, allowing her to focus on motherhood while still maintaining oversight of the business. Preston's duties as sheriff kept him busy, but rarely took him far from home. Broken Creek had grown considerably with the railroad's arrival, but it remained a largely peaceful community, its prosperity built on commerce rather than the wild elements that plagued some frontier towns. On Christmas Eve, with Hope sleeping soundly in her cradle, Preston and Lila sat before the fire in their new home, reflecting on the year that had passed and all it had brought them. "I never imagined my life could feel this complete again," Preston said, watching the flames dance. "Nor did I," Lila agreed, leaning against his shoulder. "When Thomas died, I thought that was the end of happiness for me, that the best I could hope for was to survive." Preston kissed the top of her head. "I remember that day at the cemetery, how determined you were to stand alone with your grief, and how determined you were not to let me." Lila smiled at the memory. "My heart's in the ground," she quoted herself softly. "Then I'll sit beside it with you." Preston completed the exchange that had begun their journey together. "You did more than sit beside me," Lila said, turning to face him. "You helped me find pieces of my heart I thought were lost forever. You gave me a reason to build something new." "We gave that to each other," Preston corrected gently, "and now to Hope as well." From the nursery came a soft cooing sound as their daughter stirred. Lila rose to check on her, returning moments later with Hope cradled in her arms. The baby was awake but content, her blue eyes taking in the firelit room with quiet curiosity. As Preston watched his wife and daughter in the warm glow of the fire, he felt a profound sense of gratitude for the unexpected turns his life had taken. The path through grief had been long and often lonely, but it had led him here, to this moment of perfect peace. Outside, snow continued to fall on Broken Creek, covering the town in a clean blanket of white that promised fresh beginnings. Inside, the Vance family welcomed their first Christmas together, their home filled with the quiet joy of dreams once thought impossible now made real. And in the cemetery at the edge of town, two graves lay peaceful beneath the snow. Thomas O'Hara, and far across the frontier in a Texas cemetery, Eliza and Sarah Vance. Not forgotten, but honored in the new life their loved ones had found together. For hearts once buried in sorrow had found their way back to the surface, stronger for having known both grief and joy, and richer for understanding the precious fragility of love. In the years that followed, Broken Creek grew into a prosperous town, with the Vance family at its heart. Preston served as sheriff for nearly a decade before being elected mayor. Lila expanded the store into the largest mercantile in the county, eventually opening a second location in the neighboring settlement. Hope grew into a confident young woman with her mother's business acumen and her father's sense of justice. She was joined by two brothers, Thomas James and William Samuel, completing the family in ways neither Lila nor Preston had dared to dream possible on that first morning at the cemetery, when grief had been their only common ground. And on each anniversary of their meeting, they would walk together to place flowers on Thomas O'Hara's grave, a tradition of remembrance and gratitude for the journey that had brought them through darkness into light, and taught them that even hearts buried in sorrow can find their way back to love.